Okay, so I'm going to go in here and I'm just going to kind of make sure we're on frame 8 because that's where this pose starts. And I'm going to go in and just kind of start to move this into position here. Now this obviously we're going to reach the max here when we start moving the IK, so it's going to be helpful to kind of begin to move the hips as well, kind of bring those down a bit, rotate those. It can kind of be a little bit confusing sometimes because you're going to be kind of making a mess of the rig here as you're creating a new pose. So one thing that's sometimes helpful to do, especially when you're kind of dealing with some big changes in your values over here in the channel box, is as you create new poses, just go ahead and zero out where the changes are, because sometimes you're going to end up actually fighting what values were on there prior. And if you zero it back out, it's sometimes going to be a lot easier to have to deal with than actually trying to fight with these values as they are. So I'm going to kind of create this foot here. I think we got a little bit of a foot lean on here too. I didn't end up zeroing that out. So I'm going to push this foot over to the side, rotate this, go right there. Grab our pull vector for the leg here. Actually, you know, I've got a few layers down here for this geometry. I'm going to just go ahead and hide so we don't select that. We really only want to be controlling the rig right now, and I don't want to ever control these locators. I've got them set up to where I want them to be, so I'm just going to turn those off. Again, whenever I want to adjust the position of the hand, I'm just going to use the blending between the constraints on the actual rig itself, or on the IK handle itself. So I'm going to push that forward a bit more. And now you'll see we've got a pretty decent line of action here, and I guess that's something that we need to talk about as well. When you kind of begin to set up your poses, especially if you're dealing with video reference that's shot that's not from an animation, or even if it's from an animation, the animation may not have a very good line of action to it, is you really kind of want to push these poses as far as you absolutely can without kind of breaking them. And breaking them would kind of mean, let's say, you know, you've got your center of weight for the character where the character kind of feels like they're balanced. And if you can begin to push it too far, you can actually kind of break the bounds of where the character kind of feels like it could comfortably, like a pose it could comfortably be in. You know, the line of action, that kind of goes along with the concept of exaggeration. And exaggeration is actually one of the principles of animation that's very important to follow when you kind of begin creating this pose. And it pretty much involves pushing a pose or sometimes even a whole performance in order to clearly communicate an idea of a shot or action to the audience. Now, how much of exaggeration you're going to use is usually a matter of sometimes style within the aesthetics in the animation, though it can vary depending upon maybe that specific animation's needs. When you're actually creating an animation, it's typically important to kind of understand the style of your animation and apply enough exaggeration to, let's say, your poses or performance to make sure there's a believable readability for the viewer. So here we go. We've got some more poses that we're going to sit here and do. We've got this here. We'll see that we've got when I say center of gravity now, what I mean here is it looks like if there wasn't a chair under him right here, he probably wouldn't be able to stand up. His center of gravity is pretty far back, and his spine's pretty far forward. Now we can do a few things. It looks like in this case that I kind of started to lean his torso forward and a bit over this right leg here. So let's go ahead and kind of do that a bit. And now we need to kind of, actually, you know, I've got his head facing back towards the front, so I'm going to go grab his head and neck controllers real quick. Kind of start bringing those back up here. Bring it down just a bit. So pretty much as you gather your reference or your pose reference, this is pretty much the process of kind of starting to block out your animation. Is you're just going to want to kind of start to create these poses, and time them out so that, you know, it kind of works for your animation or even the reference that you've gathered. And this is one thing's a little tricky about this is, you know, we're dealing with this constraint here. And sometimes if we get this arm in the wrong position, it can take a little bit of work to kind of re-massage it, because obviously looking at this wrist right now, it's clearly broken. So sometimes we may have to kind of, it may take a little bit of toying with to kind of bring it back to a state that's not broken and that is pushed enough. It's going to take the messing of a few different controllers to actually bring it to that. So actually that got us to a decent spot here. Again, it doesn't need to be quite perfect, but so as long as, again, you're pushing the pose, there's kind of a good solid foundation here. I would say that this is pretty close. Might not be perfect. Maybe we can adjust this to get the hammer aligned a little better. Now, as you guys kind of walk through this example here, you can kind of go in and fine-tune and kind of study these poses on the War General here as much as you'd like. But what's more important than anything else is the fact that you're getting and understanding the key concepts, so that when you don't have an example like this to walk through, that you're actually able to look at, let's say, a reference video and create poses that are fairly dynamic on your own without actually needing that exact pose to reference. Okay, well, so let's say we've got this pose here, and let's say it's pretty close. It's close enough we want to move on to the next pose. Now, what I'm going to do here is I'm going to select all the controls, and I'm just going to hit S, and that's going to create a key on every frame, kind of like I explained a bit ago. You're going to want to create a key in every frame, and what that's going to do is, let's say we want to adjust the timing of some of these poses. That's when you can kind of hit Shift Select on this frame right here, and you can actually move it out, or you can move it. So what that does is if you actually have keys on some controllers but not on others, it's going to kind of really start to mess with your timing. In your breakdown and key pose stage, makes you just go ahead and set a key on every frame as you kind of begin to step through this. So we've got our key on frame 8. Let's go ahead and move through to the next red one. So I'm going to go ahead here. Oops. Ah, there we go. Now there's one thing I did, is we've got a constraint here on this wrist. And what I did, and this is actually something we should keep an eye out for, sometimes when you're dealing with constraints, you don't want to actually set a key on the controller that has that constraint, because that's actually going to override the constraint, and you're going to start dealing with some issues where that controller's not going to want to follow it anymore. So I'm just going to delete this key here. Yeah, and there we go. So now that I've deleted the key on that frame, we're actually pretty good in the sense of we're not going to actually deal with any type of leaving behind, because that's basically setting a key saying, I know you're constrained, but you told me to stay here in space, so I kind of don't know what to do. So here we are at frame 14 now. That's our next red sphere. So here's actually a really good pose that's going to kind of talk about our line of action and our exaggeration. This is a really pushed forward based right here off his left foot. And we've kind of had this nice contrasting pose. I'm sorry, going to delete that key real quick. We had a really nice contrasting pose prior on pose 8, where the weight was really over the right side, and now we're pushing it to be really far over the left side. And as we do that, we got this kind of nice swooping line of action that goes all the way from his heel and kind of arcs up through his back leg and into his spine. So that's kind of that. I mean, we could do many things that are going to push it even more. Let's say if I want to go over here and kind of even take this controllers and begin to push it even more. But it's not to say that that wouldn't work if we did that. I opted not to. Again, it's probably for the aesthetic reasons of the animation. But it's something like this that we kind of want to get with all of our poses, where we have a nice strong pose and even a nice strong silhouette. And what I mean by the silhouette is kind of the outline of how that character looks. Let's say if it was on just a flat colored background. And actually one thing that you can do to check the silhouettes inside of Maya is, if you're using just the default lighting scheme when you have a character in here, if you hit the number 7, what that's going to do is it's actually going to take and turn our character black, because there are essentially no lights in the scene. And what we can begin to do is we can kind of step through, in this case, the animation that's already been created. We can kind of step through and see how our poses kind of silhouette. And I'm just going to reference the final key posed animation right here. We can kind of begin to see how they silhouette and how they're reading as whether keyframes or key poses and breakdowns. I'm actually going to, it's getting a little distracting for me, so let me slide this out of the way for a second. I'm going to break that so it doesn't pop back in place. So yeah, we can actually use this to see like how our line of action is maybe swooping through here, or kind of like swooping through, and where the weight is, and how well each pose is kind of reading. Now I'm willing to guess that that's a breakdown because that pose isn't very strong or isn't really necessary. Whereas here I'm going to guess that this is actually a key pose because we're going from a forward facing position here. I believe frame 14 was that key, and we go over here and he's actually facing backwards. So those are pretty important key poses that you're going to want to have, again, as he's kind of changing his either direction or center of gravity, or flat out center of gravity. So let me move this back here and we'll go ahead and start creating the next pose. Take this back here. So it's good as you kind of begin to create these animations or create these poses to kind of step through, and as you're zeroing out these channels here, this may look too far, but you can kind of adjust the ball lift, and I'm going to adjust the leg pull vector. But again, as you're kind of walking through these poses here that you're creating, continually check your line of action and continually check your center of gravity and check your silhouette, because it's really the poses that are going to kind of make or break your animation. I know it may sound kind of obvious to say, but you might be surprising like how much just having really strong poses and decent timing, how far that can actually take you in your overall quality animation. And getting there as soon as possible from the start is actually a really, really big advantage for you. So, okay. I'm just going to continue to kind of move this forward. I'm going to zero these out because it looks like he's looking forward over here. Yeah, I'm just going to zero these out and have him look up. Actually, this foot looks a little too bent. I'm actually probably going to pull back on the ball lift a bit and push out the toe lift maybe some. Yeah, doesn't have to be perfect, but pretty good like that. That foot lean, there's no really need to have a foot lean when his foot's facing forward. His weight is right over, so I'm just going to set that to 0 and kind of bring the rotation of this back down to 0 as well, or maybe even just enough so that it's straight. Again, just be aware that the arm here that you're going to deal with can be a little problematic, and not in the sense that it's truly a problem, that's something you're not going to want to deal with, but just that, adjusting the pose here is going to take just a little bit of work at times because of this constraint that we have in the IK over here. Looks like it's a little up too still. The hammer here, so I'm going to rotate this down. And that arm looks like it's still out a little bit too far. So basically what you're seeing here is just the whole process of getting your keys and your breakdown set. We're just going to walk through this whole animation here. As you kind of walk through this example, I'm going to leave it off here and jump to the end and talk about a few more things. But as you kind of walk through, just again follow those principles of exaggeration on your poses and really making sure that you got a good center of weight and that your character silhouettes well when you hit 7. And getting your timing set for however these spheres are set up. I would say go through and get your key poses set first and kind of look and see how that reads. Get your key poses set and then make sure that they're set to stepped and kind of see how that reads and see how that will impact the beats of the animation. You can actually go through and once it's set to stepped, go ahead and just save out a different version of the file and start adjusting the actual placement of just these key poses before you even begin to go through here and create the breakdowns, which are the ones that are indicated by the green sphere. And you'll see that depending on where you start to place these poses, you can kind of get a slightly different result or sometimes a drastically different result. Okay, so here we are. What I've done is I've kind of jumped through and created all of these poses. And there are a few things I kind of want to talk about as we go on here. One of them being the actual constraint animation here. Right, to say the poses that we change on this constraint. What we'll see down here is now, as opposed to the frame prior, we have our wrist constraint. And actually, there's two things I should talk about. One, wrist constraint, the keyframes on wrist constraint won't actually show up in the viewport here. They're actually something you're going to have to access from the graph editor. You'll actually see that as you set keys on here, obviously the channels are that reddish color, and as I kind of step through, and you'll see that those values change. But if you actually want to kind of see them, if you go to the graph editor here, with my IK handle selected, you'll see that I have my constraint values right here for the wrist, and it's basically for all channels because with an IK handle you can control basically both rotation and translation. So as you kind of come through here, we've got this pose here on frame, I believe 49, that's where the base key pose is. 48 actually, and then 50 is when the down pose is. So what we're going to want to do between there is you're going to want to key it so that it's at the further weight right here, or actually it looks like there's a transition, so there's actually about halfway through it right now. And then if we get back to our frame 51 over here, you're going to want to set that so that it's actually at the closer one. Because if you tried to put it at the farther one, and let me do this right here real quick. If I set this to 0 and that to 1, it wouldn't reach, and you're going to have a hard time kind of getting that into place. So if we just adjust this constraint so it's set to 1 and 0, we're going to get this basically lining with the other locator that we have our IK handle constraint to, which is right here. So another thing that I did as well, I changed the transition from an FK to an IK, which means I actually animated the blending between this pose here, where it's all the FK driving the pose of the arm, to IK. And I did this because it's kind of helpful to understand and kind of get used to blending between these two, because it's something that you're going to actually need to do at times. Let's say when you have a character for a shot that walks up and leans against a table, but you don't want their arms to penetrate to the table, but in most cases it's actually easier to pose the character's arm in FK because you have more control kind of over the angle of the arm, and it's a little bit easier to control. So I created a transition between the frame 48 and frame 51 where the IK goes from FK to IK, or I'm sorry, the arm chain goes from FK to IK. And then actually when you go back, it's actually going to return. We've got basically this hold at the end of the animation here, and as it holds, as it kind of settles in a bit, starting at about frame 71, as you see when I click over here to frame 87 where the animation ends, it goes back to your FK as well. So we're going to get a little practice here in the next section on kind of working at smoothing out those transitions as well. So that pretty much completes this section. We've gone through and just pretty much created all of our poses for our animation, and I've got it on step, and hopefully you guys were able to kind of test the silhouette and kind of see how important this actual phase is, and hopefully you're able to kind of mess with the timing of these poses as well to see how even in step form how it can kind of create different effects for your emotion or your motion, and see how much kind of weight it can add or take away from your character. So the next section, what we're going to do is we're going to go over and start our splining phase and kind of begin to smooth out this animation and add some more principles of animation like overlap, and like kind of begin to soften out the weight distribution and the transition between these keyframes and these breakdowns, or these key poses and breakdowns that we've set.